Good evening, everybody. My name is Travis Pipes. I am the host of Double Coverage Radio here on Facebook and www.doublecoverageradio.com. Sitting alongside me is Dave Mogensen, former offensive coordinator for the Indoor Football League's Green Bay Blizzard. Dave, tonight is sort of like Christmas Day as it pertains to the NFL schedule. How are you doing? Welcome back to the show. You ready to talk about some matchups as they pertain to the Packers and the NFL in general?
Yeah, definitely. Schedule release day is always a fun, exciting day. People can circle games, plan their parties, and plan their events.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. I think one of the things we should talk about before we get into the actual gist of the schedule is the NFL allowing teams to leak, right, the schedule specifics before their actual schedule release. So there's been kind of rumblings throughout the course of the day about the Packers and where they would line up as it pertains to the schedule, as well as other teams. Guys like ESPN's Adam Schefter and others saying specifics around those dates for Sunday night, Monday night football games, which we've kind of known, right? You look at Green Bay's schedule, we've known who the opponents are going to be since December. Now we get to talk about how the schedule stacks up. One of the things I'd like for us to lead into is Green Bay being 5-0 as they start the season since 2016. Their last loss was at Seattle in 2014. Talk to me about momentum and Green Bay potentially having the opportunity to start off strong in Matt LaFleur's second season.
I think it's a big thing. The way the Packers ended, right? They had that bad taste in their mouth with the San Francisco loss and big hopes that came with a season that was better than they thought it was going to be. So a lot of stock is put into the second year of a head coach's system, right? So we don't know yet what's going to happen with training camp and mini camps and those things along those lines. Now there's some discussion of NFL teams being able to reopen their facilities soon, hopefully. So the NFL did push back the start of the season a little bit to kind of play in the calendar too. So there's some things they've done, and we got to kind of see how it plays out. But if the Packers are able to have a good series of mini camps and training camps, you're looking for that big second year push. Nothing better to kickstart that than another win, which would be their seventh opening game win in a row.
Yeah, it is always important to get that first one win. How big is it from you as a coaching, with your coaching perspective, to start the season with a win?
I mean, it's definitely something that you want to always strive for, right? Obviously, everybody wants to do that. Not everybody gets it done, but you work so much for that first game, right? Every other game after that, you got at most 2 weeks, generally 1 week, right? So you have all this time to game plan and get prepared. And early on in training camp, right, it's trying to finish the roster, figure out who the guys are. So it's not always focused on that first team you're playing in week one, but a lot of the stuff you're doing just to see how guys can work is you're going against the defense you're going to see in week one. You may not say that's the guys, may not tell them that, but you're kind of putting it in as a coach and getting ready for it. So with the amount of time that goes into the preparation, it's really kind of a big deflating thing if you lose that first game, especially for the coaching staff because of the amount of time they did on prepping and game planning and install for that first.
How big of a role do you think it is going to be for each of these teams to say, hey, we've got to scramble. We didn't get the full complementary offseason program with mini camps and OTAs, and we don't know the specifics of training camp. Kind of right now, we're looking at the outer edges of what the actual season is going to look like now that we're getting into the schedule part of it. How are you looking at it from a coaching perspective in terms of this is what we have to prepare for? We know who our opponents are. How's it going to go into the offseason? What are we looking for a team to open up the season, whether it's a home game or an away game?
Yeah, I definitely think that with the unknowns out there, you're going to see a few things happen. We already saw it with the draft, right? The amount of small school guys that generally get drafted or signed as a free agent was much smaller this year than it has been in year past, because they weren't able to get that exposure. But I think you're going to see again throughout the summer, depending on how things open up. If they open up and get more normal, then it will be business as usual. But what possibly could happen is you're going to lean on veterans, right? And some of the rookies that come in, they're not going to get the same amount of time to get in place and understand the systems, and even being able to look at a playbook and review film remotely is much different than getting that coaching in a meeting room and on the field in mini camps and training camps and throughout the summer, and even just being at the facility, right? So I think you're going to see a lot more veterans that might have normally been cut stick around, and you're going to probably see less of an impact from most rookies than you normally would see.
How does that affect your preparation if you're a guy that's sort of a roster fringe player, maybe an undrafted guy that's coming into training camp? Are you at a disadvantage if you didn't get the time at the facility before training camp opens?
You're definitely at a disadvantage, right? So there's no way around it. You're going to be at a disadvantage, but the thing is, everybody in that role is going to be at a disadvantage. Every rookie on each team is going to be at a disadvantage because they don't have the same kind of stuff that people have had in years past. The best those guys can do is when you get access to the playbook, get it studied at your house. Make sure you're coming in tip top shape because you're not going to have a lot of time for that stuff. You're going to have to get in there and show them what you can do right away. And for these undrafted guys and the guys at the lower part of the draft, the key to them making the team is special teams, right? So they have to buy into that fact. And sometimes you get guys who don't want to buy into the fact that their way to make this team a special team. They're drafted as a receiver or a running back, and they're so focused on making that big catch in a 7-on-7 format or really impressing their position coach in drills that they lose sight of the fact that their way to make the team is on special teams. And that's something that, those guys, hopefully they're people that are mentoring them and their agents are really hammering that home that, hey, if you're going to make this team as the fifth wideout or the third or fourth running back or the eighth defensive lineman, it's because you are a difference maker on special teams.
That's a really good point. We talk about how you can contribute as a roster player, whether you're at the back end of the roster, on the final 53 or one of the penciled in starters. For you, Dave, as a coach, as you've gone through the experiences in your coaching, in your coaching life, how has looking at the schedule really factored into what you guys do to prepare? I know there's a cliche of taking it 1 week at a time. How realistic is it for Matt LaFleur to come into Green Bay and say, hey, we're talking about week one, we're looking at the Vikings. Are we looking ahead to Tampa Bay and Tom Brady? Are we looking ahead to Drew Brees and the Saints, which is a early part of the schedule, which we'll get to? How big of a role does that play in terms of the matchups and where you see preparation playing a part?
I think every coach wants to win every game, right? So every NFL coach wants to go 16-0. And what the NFL coaches are doing right now, and we don't know, maybe they get this information earlier in the day, maybe they got it, teams got it, before the public did, right? But as soon as they get that information, I guarantee you, every single coach is doing the same thing that we are doing as fans, right? Is looking at the schedule, circling, that's a win, that's probably a loss, that's a win, that's a loss, right? So it's not that Matt LaFleur and his staff thinks that we're going to lose for sure in some games, but they look at it realistically, saying, okay, let's look at how things line up. We're probably have a good chance to go 12-4 or 10-6, or we have to work to get to this or that. So they sit there and they look at each game and say, Minnesota week one, we got to win that game. Otherwise, we're in a hole because we're probably going to lose this game or that game. We'll go through game by game for the Packers and look at it. But just like the fans do at home, is circling the games and looking at them and projecting what the record's going to be, the coaching staff's doing the same thing, and they kind of chart out their season, right? So if they sit here and say we realistically have a chance to go 13-3, they'll let the team know, hey, our goal is 13-3 this year, and they might not tell them these are the games we got to win. Let's say they have a week one win versus Minnesota as one of their 13s, and they don't win that game. Now they got to figure out which one of those three losses can they turn into a win to stay on track.
Yeah, it's a really good point you bring up. How realistic is it that each of these organizations, say Matt LaFleur, for example, is looking at the season in 4 quarters of length, right? You look at it in how do we break it down to the first 4 games, right? Halfway point of the season is game 8. When we look at the Packers schedule, we'll take a look at when their bye is, and we'll have some questions for you in terms of preparation. How realistic then is it, Dave, for a team to say, hey, we can get to this particular mile marker at the pole, look at it like it's a horse race, and will be competitive at whatever point. Does that factor into any of the planning as the season and the offseason starts to wind down?
Definitely, everybody wants to incremental things and put things together, right? Set incremental goals for a season, right? So if our season goal is to be 13-3 as a team, we're going to sit there and say, okay, by the time we hit our bye week, the Packers look to have an early bye week, right? So by the time we hit our bye week, we have to be 4-1, right, to stay on track to our 13-3, right? Then we'll figure that week 8 week and say, okay, by the time we hit midway of the season, we got to be 6-2 to make this thing work, right? So they'll definitely put incremental goals in there, right? And part of that is that 13-3, but they also want to win the division, right? So they're going to look at it from two ways: what
Right.
what our overall record is and what our division record is, and making sure we're staying on top. And, Packers could be finished 12-4, and all four of their losses could be NFC North teams. They could lose the NFC North be with a 12-4 record, right? So that's definitely incremental goals are put in by all coaching staffs.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of look at it as how do we break it down into these manageable sort of bite-sized portions. Speaking of bite-sized portions, let's go ahead and pull up the Green Bay Packers 2020 NFL schedule and we'll talk about the matchups as they appear. Here we go. So we've got Green Bay on the schedule, all 17 games. I know you just mentioned the bye week situation. Let's take a look at the first 5 games of the season and kind of talk us through where some of the strengths in the schedule are. Obviously, Green Bay, we talked about in the intro, 5-0 in their last opening weeks. Week 1 of 2020. They're on the road at the Minnesota Vikings. Tell me a little bit more about this matchup. How do you feel about Green Bay going up to face Kirk Cousins on the road at US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis?
I definitely think we know that's a place that's been notoriously hard for Packer fans to win, even in the Favre era, right? That was always a tough place for the Packers to go and win. But they are riding this 5 game season opening winning streak, right? They definitely have the tools to go up there and face Minnesota. We kind of think Minnesota's a little bit on a downward trend, and we think the Packers should hopefully be on an upward trend, right? So it's a position where I think the Packers are going to be really fighting. That's a game they really have to win, right? Any division game's a must win, but if you look at these first 5 games, drawing the NFC South this year, not a great year to have to play NFC South teams, right? So you go on that NFC South gamut with you got the Saints and the Falcons, and then coming out of the bye week, the Buccaneers with Tom Brady now, right? That makes those first 2 games really kind of in my head must win games for the Packers.
How critical is it to start out of the gate 1-0, maybe 2-0? I think a lot of people, fans will maybe mirror this sentiment. Packers go on the road. Let's say Green Bay falls to the Vikings to go 0-1. I think it's probably pretty much common sentiment that the Packers are going to potentially win at Detroit, or excuse me, Detroit at home. Would a 1-1 division split set you up for some important games against the Saints and Falcons in Week 3 and 4?
I mean, you're looking at it 2 ways, right? The 1-1 division split, with one of the losses being to the Vikings, you kind of look at a grand spectrum that probably going to not beat the Vikings both times, right? Because they're still a pretty good football team. So a 1-1 split there, I think is okay. But then again, you look at that stretch run, right? The other thing to consider is Packer fans are not really exactly happy with how the offseason's gone thus far. A loss in week one is just going to up that ante, and whether the coaching staff and the players want to hear it and buy into it that much, it's still going to be there, right? Like, oh, we lost to Minnesota. Would we have lost if Patrick Queen was playing middle linebacker? Would we have lost if Justin Jefferson was our wideout? God forbid Justin Jefferson catches a touchdown or something in that game, right? So there's those other variables, that outside variables that'll be in there that kind of tie back into this game one, right? All that bent up frustration will either kind of Packer fans will go, all right, not too bad. Alan Lazard had a good game, or EQ had a good game, right? Or it's going to just compound from months and months and months of people being kind of upset on the internet to say, see, I told you we should have took somebody else.
Yeah, if Green Bay gives up X amount of yards defensively, let's say they give up a 200 plus yard rushing day to Dalvin Cook on the Vikings and J.K. Dobbins or other running backs, gash them for large yardage chunks. Does Patrick Queen resolve those issues in the middle? If Patrick Queen, middle linebacker that was taken from LSU by the Ravens, plays well for Baltimore and they go on a deep run and maybe win a Super Bowl, then we probably hear the chatter a little bit louder. So let's take a look at the Green Bay at New Orleans Saints. It's a Sunday night football matchup on the road at the New Orleans Superdome against Drew Brees towards the end of his career. How do we see Green Bay coming out of that matchup?
I mean, the Saints are one of the best teams in the NFC. So you're looking through here in the first 5 games through 6 weeks, right, with that bye in week 5 mixed in there. And the Packers are playing 3 of the top teams in the whole conference, with the Vikings, with the Saints, and with the Buccaneers. At least
Right.
we perceive the Buccaneers are going to be part of that echelon with Tom Brady. So going with the Saints, going down to New Orleans, right? It's not an easy place to play. Again, a dome. Drew Brees is getting up in age, but he's still one of the best quarterbacks in the league. They now have Jameis Winston as a backup. They still have Taysom Hill. They have Michael Thomas, right? Kamara, and then their defense is still there, right? Their defense is not bad. Their defense is good, right? So they're an overall a good team. Team that's going to struggle for the Packers. The one caveat to that is they're not a power running team. So that's kind of where you kind of feel like right now the Packers' poison, at least last year, was that power running team. There's a couple teams down the list on the schedule that might scare us from that perspective. But you're
Right.
looking at what the Packers' strengths are versus what at least defensively, versus what the offensive strengths are for New Orleans, and you feel like, okay, Packers got a pretty good shot, and same vice versa. New Orleans isn't known for being a great run stopping defense as well. So if the Packers are really truly going to try to get into this outside zone power running scheme with a lot of play action and RPO stuff, similar to what San Francisco is doing on offense, I think it does bode well for the Packers to go down there and get a victory.
Yeah, and New Orleans, we have to remember this specific statistic. Green Bay on the road all time at New Orleans is 8-4-1. So their winning record on the road at the Superdome is pretty good. And the Packers beat the New England Patriots at the Superdome in January of 1996 to win Super Bowl 31. So historically, they've got some opportunities. Also, the Saints coming in at 15th in the league in total yards given up per carry. So that bodes well for Aaron Jones and new addition AJ Dillon. I like Green Bay's chances to win this game on the road and go to 2-1 after that opening week loss to Minnesota. How are we looking at the Atlanta Falcons on a Monday night at Lambeau Field? Lambeau Field rocking against Matt Ryan and the Falcons, looming on the horizon after that matchup. Is this a trap game if you're Matt LaFleur with Tampa Bay on the road and Tom Brady, the six-time Super Bowl champion, awaiting in Week 6?
I don't think it's a game because they do have the bye week after, right? If it was back to back, it could be something where you could overlook the Falcons, but they're going into the bye week. They have that week 5 bye week, so very early bye week. First round of bye weeks, Packers get picked on there. So if I'm looking at this schedule and I'm trying to devise a playoff team, I'm looking at week 4, Atlanta home Monday night, the only Monday night game they have all year, as a must win game, right? And sometimes you look at those games and you're like, really, is that a must win? But as you get down to the end of the schedule, if you lose that game, you're going to constantly be looking at, man, we really should have beat Atlanta in week 4. We should have had that win. So to me, that's a must win game to kind of put the Packers in position to be a division champ and be in good progress in the playoffs is winning that Atlanta game in week 4.
What's the most important factor going into the bye week with such an early bye? A lot of teams talk about, hey, let's have a bye that's after week 7 or week 8, sometime in the early first part of the first half of the schedule. Is it a disadvantage for Matt LaFleur with such a road heavy schedule in the second half as we start to break it down to have a bye week in week 5?
I definitely think an earlier bye week is always somewhat of a disadvantage, right? You never know how the Cards could play. You could have a weird injury to somebody, and they could use that extra time off, and it could end up being something that's good. But
Right.
more often than not, you want to try to get that as close to midway through the season as you can, right? We talk about those incremental goals earlier in the show. If you can get that bye week around, ideally after that week 8 and split that bye week right there, you can have that kind of set that goal and say, hey, going into the bye week, we want to be here, right? And then we only have X amount of games left afterwards. With a bye week early on in week 5, it makes that stretch run seem a little bit longer because you're coming out of that break in week 6.
Yeah, as we take a look at the schedule again, following that bye, Green Bay is on the road in a late afternoon game at Raymond James Stadium, which is going to be the host of Super Bowl 54, as it were, against new addition Tom Brady, Rob Gronkowski, and the rest of that crew. Let's talk about the stretch of games there from week 6 through week 10. We've got on the road at Tampa Bay in week 6, and then a on the road game at JJ Watt, Deshaun Watson and company on October 25th in the afternoon against the Houston Texans. And then we play again at the Minnesota Vikings in Green Bay. What's your takeaway if we can get to week 6 or week 7 from a win-loss perspective to sort of remain competitive? Because obviously the NFC is going to be a stacked conference depending on how you look at it the first half of the year.
Yeah, I definitely think right now where you're at with football, there's overall a higher level of solid, good teams in the NFC than there is the AFC, right? So I think the good thing about playing Buccaneers in week 6 as opposed to maybe in week 3 is you're going to have 5 weeks of film on them with Brady, right? The film from last year is going to be okay. It's still Arians. You got years of Bruce Arians film, but watching the film from last year is you might as well watch film from when he was with Pittsburgh Steelers or when he was with Arizona Cardinals, right? Because it's going to change somewhat with Tom Brady. So the defensive staff for the Packers having 5 weeks to review that is better than having just a couple of weeks, right? So that's a plus there. And I think the Packers have as good a shot as anybody to go on there and beat the Buccaneers. Their defense is still kind of a young and improving defense, so hopefully, at worst, it's a shootout. Packers win. You're going then into week 7 with the Texans. It's kind of one of those toss-up games, right? That could be a trap game if you're looking at coming out of a bye week. You always want to win coming out of a bye week, right? Again, it goes to that preparation thing. You got 2 weeks to prepare for the Buccaneers. They're going to have 1 week to prepare for you. You feel like you need to win that game. And then you have a big game, divisional game with Minnesota coming after the Texans. So if there's a trap game early on in that first half of the season, it's definitely that Texans game. We can laugh and joke about Bill O'Brien all we want, but the Texans have been a solid football team for him for a number of years since he came there. Deshaun Watson's game-breaking quarterback, so definitely have all the tools needed to beat the Packers. But it's one of those games where if the Packers are going to be a division winner and they're going to be a 12-4, 11-5, or above team, that's one of those games they have to come out with a victory.
Yeah, and Green Bay since 2000 is 15-5 coming out of the bye. So they historically have played well coming out of the bye. I agree. I think at the Houston Texans is potentially a huge game. Obviously, you think of Houston, you think defensively of J.J. Watt, the Pewaukee, Wisconsin native, and their opportunity to come back home to Lambeau Field and take on the Minnesota Vikings and Kirk Cousins again. Then we get to the daunting part of the schedule starting in week 9 at the San Francisco 49ers. 0-2 against the Niners, 0-3 on the West Coast last year, if you count the debacle in the Los Angeles area against the Chargers. Let's take a little bit of time and talk about the 49ers, given the way the NFC Championship shook out last year. What do you see as maybe the two key factors of that game? Not knowing how the offense, shakes out, not knowing who some of the key role players are going to be offensively. What's the biggest thing to focus on if you're Matt LaFleur heading out to the West Coast for the third time against the Niners this year?
I think the biggest thing the Packers, obviously, Packer fans and the Packer players and front office and coaches probably have circled this game. They want to get back at San Francisco, right? They kind of got embarrassed 2 times going out there. 3 trips to the West Coast last year, all were embarrassing losses, right? So I think definitely it's a circled game by the staff or the fans, the players, all the above, right? I'm not as concerned about them winning that game as probably the average fan, right? So that if you're going through, to me, that circle as a loss, right? It's going across. We just came off a gamut of 3 really tough games against Buccaneers, Texans, and a really tough in-conference game against the Vikings, right? You're going to go out to San Francisco. So it's a night game to get a little bit of extra kind of play in there, albeit only a few hours. But if the Packers can get out there and at least be competitive in the game, right, that can set them up for some future success. The worst thing I think can happen to these guys is if they go out there and lose bad again. If you go out there and for the third time in 2 seasons lose bad again, then you start getting those thoughts of maybe we can't beat these guys. Maybe we're not good enough to beat these guys. They're much better than us. So, as great as it would be to get a W there, I think just having a competitive game is the most important thing for the rest of the Packers season.
Yeah, I would agree. At that point in the schedule, kind of being at the halfway stage or so, do you think it's a disadvantage if Green Bay goes out, plays a little bit better, maybe loses a close game to the 49ers, and that sets them up for the second half of the season? Or do you think it's a must win? Does Matt LaFleur and Mike Pettin and the rest of the staff have they circled that game as sort of, the rest of these games are important, but this is the one we have to win to sort of change the narrative?
I definitely don't think that it's a must win. I don't think it's a must win game. It's a non division game. It's a conference game, which could play into some tiebreakers and things like that. But I don't think it's a must win. I do think it's a must that they're competitive in it. It's one of those games where you can lose it, kind of like last year, right? They lost it, and you just turn a page and say, hey, we lost that game. Big deal, right? Even if they get blown out again, you can say, hey, it doesn't matter. We can still win a division. We still, split with the Vikings or what have you. We're sitting in first place in the NFC North, and we can still kind of push our way into the playoffs and see them again, and we'll improve. But I think it's really important for the psyche of the guys that they have to play a competitive game against them because you can't have 3 games in a row when you sit there and you go, we can't beat these guys if you get blown out again.
How big of an issue is it going to be for the Green Bay Packers and our fans if Brandon Ayuk goes off against the Niners?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be something where you look at where they're at with the schedule, right? If they're sitting there at 5-2 going into San Francisco, I don't think Ayuk could have 5 touchdowns, and I don't think the Packers players will say, "Oh, we would be 8-0 if we had him," right? But it's all relative, right? If Ayuk ends up to be Randy Moss, you're going to hear it. If he's just an okay player, and the Packers have a good record, I think you won't hear that same stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I think obviously Ayuk, you don't want him to play all that well in that game, particularly since the Niners traded up ahead of you to grab the player. Let's talk a little bit about week 10, 11, and 12 for the Packers. After that Niners game, they on November 15th are home against the Jacksonville Jaguars. A little bit of uncertainty on the schedule on paper that looks to be a little bit more of a favorable matchup for Green Bay. Then they're on the road at Indianapolis, where Philip Rivers landed in free agency. Then they're following that with a game at home against the Chicago Bears. How do you look at this 3 game stretch in terms of scheduling? Let's say Green Bay coming into week 10 is maybe 5-4, maybe 4-5 or 500. How important is it to close that last couple quarters of the season, on a high note?
I think it's a very definite possibility that the Packers come out of Week 9 sitting at a 4-4, 3-5 kind of situation, or 5-3, or something like that. That's probably their toughest run of the season, Week 6 through 9. Right? That's a really tough stretch. It would have been great to get that bye week in there to mix that up, but it's not the way it's going to happen, right? So then
Right.
they open up into that 10, 11, 12 as kind of a breather moment, right? Jacksonville, arguably the worst on paper team that they have on the schedule. Okay, so we're looking at them as probably heavy rebuilding, second year quarterback that they don't really know if is going to be good or not in Gardner Minshew. So they're not really sure the direction of where they're going to go. We're not sure if Leonard Fournette's going to even be on the team by the time the season starts. They're kind of back to rebuilding mode, right? They had that run to the AFC Championship game a few years ago, kind of blew the team up since then. They're back to rebuild. So you think that's got to be a must win, right? Especially if they're coming off a loss to the 49ers or they've lost a couple of games in that stretch. They got to win that one. Coming back to the Colts, right? We don't know what's going to happen with the Colts. Good
Right.
team, solid team. Philip Rivers is Philip Rivers going to be able to come out and have is he going to still be there by week 11? Is he going to be healthy? Is he going to play like he did last year, or is he going to be the Philip Rivers from a couple years ago? But don't forget, the Packers played Philip Rivers last year, and they ended up getting a loss against the Chargers.
Right. Philip Rivers knows Green Bay's secondary in and out, obviously, in that debacle in Week 9 last year, where the Packers lost on the road against the Chargers. Let's focus a little bit more on the remaining schedule with the teams in the division with the Chicago Bears. How do we feel about Mitch Trubisky? I know we've talked about him on a number of other occasions in terms of the quarterbacking. Do you think there's a realistic possibility that the Packers are going to see more of Nick Foles in this matchup? Head coach Matt Nagy from the Bears has said it's an open competition for the Bears at quarterback. Where's their best chance to win? Is it with Foles under center or Mitch Trubisky in Week 12?
I think you're going to see Nick Foles most likely start the season as the starting quarterback, right? I don't see any way that Trubisky beats him out in training camp if it's a true open competition. And I actually think it's skewed the other way to where it's really Nick Foles' job to lose. I think them not tendering him his fifth-year option really flips the gear, and they're bringing Nick Foles in to be the bridge guy until they can find their next franchise quarterback, right? So I think the only way you see Mitch Trubisky by week 12 is if Nick Foles is injured or he's just not playing well, right? The Bears are going to be in a position where if somebody's not playing well, whether it's Foles or Trubisky, they're going to do some back and forth kind of game because they don't have a settled quarterback position. But if you're looking at this schedule for the Packers, the Bears and the Lions games are really must wins, right? You got to win. You've got to sweep those guys again if you want to win this division. Obviously, things can change, and we definitely think the Lions are a team that could be a sleeper to push for a wild card, right? So, and again, last year the Packers beat them twice without ever leading for any second of regulation. So it's not that they killed the Lions last year, but I definitely think that those two games with the Bears circle as must wins, and I think the Bears are probably going to be looking from the bottom up when the end of the season rolls around in the NFC North.
Wow. So if you're the offensive coordinator on Matt Nagy's staff, you're giving the advantage to Nick Foles. I actually tend to agree with you on this perspective. I think it's Trubisky's opportunity there to maybe continue to stay on the roster. In my opinion, he's probably on a different team, maybe as a backup, kind of similar to Jameis Winston this year, Marcus Mariota. I do like Nick Foles to win the starting job out of training camp as well. The key there is being healthy, and Green Bay all time against Chicago since 2010 is 8-2 at home against the Bears. So that's an important statistic to remember since that first game is at Lambeau Field. Moving our direction onward to Week 15, the Philadelphia Eagles at Green Bay. How are we feeling about the new quarterback Jalen Hurts? Is there a competition at quarterback, maybe a controversy if you're Frank Reich and the Eagles?
I definitely don't think there's any quarterback controversy there right now. They have a lot invested in Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz has proven to be a very good NFL quarterback, one of the best quarterbacks in the NFC, right? But Jalen Hurts gives them a quality backup. We know Wentz has had some injury issues. I wouldn't say he's injury prone, but he definitely had some injury issues. We just talked about Nick Foles. We all know the story of Nick Foles taking over for Wentz and leading the Eagles to the Super Bowl, right? What I think Jalen Hurts does is gives them a quality backup, a guy that they can use in a Taysom Hill role, right? He's the flavor of the day in the NFL, Taysom Hill style, right? So Jalen Hurts is, I think, a more of an accomplished passer than Taysom Hill, but he can come into the league in somewhat of a Cordell Stewart-esque intro into the league, right? You go back to the late 90s, mid 90s when Cordell Stewart came out of Colorado, and they didn't know if he's going to be a wideout or he's going to be a quarterback. And Bill Cowher, they drafted him, and they had it in Tretch starter and Neil O'Donnell. And they used Cordell Stewart in the backfield. They used him as wideout. They used him as a kick returner. I think you could see some of that same stuff with Jalen Hurts, where they use some different packages, using him as a running back or as a slot or some kind of trick play stuff. Doug Peterson is known to be a guy who likes to roll the dice a little bit on some of the trick plays and things along those lines. So I think using him creatively will allow them to kind of maximize what they get out of Jalen Hurts more than just a backup quarterback.
Yeah, I love the reference to the mid to late '90s Cordell Stewart, also known as Slash. Great perspective there. Let's quickly take an audible here and rewind to the Chicago Bear matchup. Viewer Mike Nortontoff has said, "I'd give the advantage to Foles as well." Breaking training camp of the Chicago Bears. Bye bye Trubisky. Mike, thanks for the follow, and hope you enjoyed the show tonight. As we said, in the NFC North, there's going to be some potential mix-up with quarterback Matt Stafford in Detroit. It's kind of a wild card. Kirk Cousins with the Minnesota Vikings, and then the coin toss with Nick Foles and Mitch Trubisky. If you're building a team and you're a general manager or head coach, Dave, of any of these teams outside of Green Bay and the division, and you have to choose somebody besides Aaron Rodgers, who's going to be your starting quarterback? You have to pick somebody from the division, though, to start your organization with. Who's it going to be?
So if you're looking us for somebody to win a championship right now or start a team with, I think it's pretty obvious answer, right? So if you're looking at MC quarterbacks, if you take the two Bears guys, throw them both in there, Trubisky and Foles, Cousins and Matt Stafford, I think it's without a doubt Matt Stafford is the second best quarterback in the NFC North, right? He's on a Hall of Fame kind of trajectory. Obviously, he's played for some not great teams in Detroit, but he's put up a lot of statistics and he's done a lot of good things. There's just been, they had a couple of years when they had Jim Caldwell there, kind of pushing towards the playoffs and kind of finished his rebuild. And they're hoping they can push this rebuild to coincide at the end of Stafford's career. But I definitely think if I was picking a team, Matt Stafford out of NFC North quarterbacks, Matt Stafford is the top guy by a mile, right? You take Matt Stafford and put him on Minnesota, or you put him on the Bears. I don't think there's a question at all that he's the starting quarterback in either of those two teams.
Yeah, and if I'm the offensive coordinator for any of these teams, I'm probably taking Jordan Love, but that's a whole other show we're going to get into. Let's talk a little bit more about the 2020 NFL schedule as it applies to your Green Bay Packers. Week 14 on the road against Matt Stafford's Lions. What's the potential situation with Matt Patricia? He's on the hot seat. I think is probably very realistically the perspective here in the division. Does Detroit and Matt Patricia have to qualify for a playoff spot for him to kind of get off that hot seat? And does Green Bay, who's historically had Detroit's number, is this a game that you're looking on the schedule saying, road game against the Lions late in the season? Is it that big of a concern if you're Matt LaFleur?
I definitely think, like I said, I think the Lions and the Bears are probably the second and third team in the division, unless Minnesota really takes a dive. And they did lose 9 starters. They kind of backfilled that mostly with guys already on their team or drafted guys. So if anybody's going to take a big tumble, it could be Minnesota. But I think the Lions, I don't know if Patricia's necessarily on a big hot seat, but I think they need to show progress, right? Not having Stafford for much of last year really kind of gives them a year a pass for that year. But I definitely think that they need to show progress this year, push towards a playoff spot, and then if that they don't have the progress, they'll be in a hot seat in 2021. But I like the roster the Lions have. I like what they put together, and I definitely think if they can kind of put everything to all the pieces in place this year, it could be a team that's tough to deal with in the NFC North, and it's a team that Packers have to beat, but it's not going to be simple, as last year's Lions game showed.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Detroit on paper, they're the team that maybe potentially could give Green Bay's offense the most trouble. A lot of people are not talking about Jamie Collins and guys like Mike Daniels and some of those veteran players. Obviously, Darius Slay left in free agency to the Philadelphia Eagles. They drafted Jeff Okuda with a third pick in the draft to sort of lock down one of those X or Z receiver roles, which is going to be important for them to do in the division. I agree. It's kind of a toss up. I think Green Bay does win against the Lions in both those matchups. First in week 2, and then again in week 14. Green Bay will move on then to play the Carolina Panthers. That date has kind of been left up to flex material for the NFL scheduling committee at home against Carolina. What's sort of the biggest thing with this division in the NFC South that you see as being a challenge? Cam Newton, we know, is obviously gone, is going to land somewhere else. From a quarterback perspective, with Matt Rule, the new head coach who just came from Baylor, how do we like the matchup against Carolina in week 15?
I definitely like the Packers matchup. I think they match up really well in the same things that Carolina has done. Obviously, we don't know exactly what Matt Rule is going to bring. He brought the offensive coordinator from LSU with him to be his offensive coordinator. So we'll see what kind of offense we get. They signed Teddy Bridgewater to take over for Cam Newton. I personally think that's probably a little bit of a step down overall. Cam Newton's, I think, a little more dynamic quarterback than Teddy Bridgewater, but I think he probably fits the system that Rule wants to bring in, and he's a little bit younger, not too much younger than Cam Newton. But again, it's one of those games. You're looking at it, you're saying this is a rebuilding team. Who knows where they're going to be by the end of the season? And it's a game that if you're a playoff team and you're a division winner, you circle that as a must win.
Are you circling that game if you're Aaron Jones, given the contract extension that Christian McCaffrey signed and sort of the uncertainty in that Green Bay running game? Obviously, those are two different echelons of players. Christian McCaffrey is sort of an do everything, all purpose, 2,200 yard a season sort of all purpose back. Does Aaron Jones have the right to circle that on the schedule and say, hey, give me the rock a bunch of times. Let me show you that I'm your version in the Midwest of Christian McCaffrey?
Yeah, well, definitely, especially if that was an early season game, I think that would definitely be the narrative, right? If that was a first 3 or 4 weeks of the season, that'd be the narrative of Aaron Jones versus McCaffrey, and McCaffrey just got the big contract. You have to see what kind of year Aaron Jones has by then. But if they're sitting there both among the conference or league leaders in rushing stats, I think you'll definitely see that kind of played out in the week as they prepare for the game, as the Aaron Jones versus Christian McCaffrey. And you're right, Aaron Jones can use that. He's going into a contract year. Those are the kind of things that his agent can say, hey, we went head to head with Christian McCaffrey, and I had X amount of yards versus his X amount of yards, and I had this many touchdowns, and I did this many kind of things. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey is kind of the stallmate of the flex running back wide receiver that Aaron Jones is kind of proven to be. He's the guy setting the bar right now in the NFL for that. So he's definitely a guy that Aaron Jones wants to be compared to on the field and in contract world.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that stacks up heading into the close of the season at the 3/4 mark. And Green Bay going to be heading in Week 16 to play at home against the Tennessee Titans. How do you feel about Ryan Tannehill? Historically, he's 1-4 at Green Bay in his career, both as a backup and a starter. He obviously played many years with Miami Dolphins. Do you see Tennessee and Derrick Henry in their offense something that Matt LaFleur is trying to mimic in terms of going to more of a one cut power scheme? And how do you think it shakes up in terms of their ability to stop the run for the Packers?
This is a game that kind of probably in his head, Matt LaFleur is wants to win, right? This is where he's coming from. He was the offensive coordinator there when before he came to be the Packers head coach. So there's a lot of variables in this game that I think make it a very interesting game, especially for a point in the season where at this point a Week 16 game like that could almost be a game they don't even need, right? Depends on where they're at for playoff positioning and stuff like that. A not only a non-division game but a non-conference game, right? It's going against an AFC opponent, so there's a lot of variables to have to see where we play out in Week 16, but it's definitely a game that I think from Packer fans' perspective, if the Titans are the same Titans they were last year and Derrick Henry's still running wild over people, it's a game that should scare you a little bit based on what has hurt the Packers in the Matt LaFleur era of year one, right? Not really the same kind of offense as San Francisco had, but an offense where they're looking to pound the football with Derrick Henry, and that's kind of proven to be a little bit of a weakness for the Packers thus far in this new era. And that's a game that, again, it might not mean that much, but with Matt LaFleur kind of probably wanting that game, that's where his last stop was as a coordinator. He's trying to mimic somewhat of a power run offense, and obviously we know that Tennessee rode Derrick Henry deep into the playoffs with that same kind of style. So it's something that is an interesting game and kind of should make for a good Week 16 game.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's not a must win necessarily, depending on where the schedule sits. But I think the comparisons between Matt LaFleur's experience as the offensive coordinator, I think Green Bay could win this game. They obviously have to play good defensively, stymie the running game of Tennessee and put it in the hands of Ryan Tannehill, who has not done all that well. He has a career touchdown to interception ratio of 6-4. So he's not blowing it up in terms of being that effective if you put the ball in his hands and make him go out and win the game. So I think Green Bay stands a chance in that one. We asked earlier what your favorite game you're looking forward to here on Double Coverage Radio. Mike Norntop again says, I'm actually looking forward to the Niners game this season. Sounds crazy, I know, but that is a game that I think will go differently this season. I tend to agree. I think not very often in the NFL does a team go 0-3 against a common opponent. I don't want to step back too far as we apply our perspective to the schedule now, but from a schedule perspective and strength of schedule, the Packers are eighth most difficult schedule in the NFL. Does that play a role on paper, Dave, for you as an offensive coordinator and your experience in game planning? How important is that when you look at the schedule and say, hey, I'm going to call my guys, I'm in my position group, we're at the Niners again? How do you feel about that as a player?
I definitely. I mean, the Packers have known now for a while that they're gonna face San Francisco, right? So whether it was home or away or whatever, that was kind of irrelevant to them at that point because they knew that they were going to be playing San Francisco and they knew they wanted to win and get back at them. So I think the way the season ended, right? Whether they didn't get them scheduled before they knew they were scheduled, they probably figured they were going to maybe face them in the playoffs, and they kind of were trying to think, how can we improve our team to get to the level of 49ers, right? That's probably every team in the NFC, but more so the Packers because they lost to them twice last year in kind of bad fashion, right? So I think it's something that's definitely in the back of guys' minds. Once they saw that they had to play them in the regular season, it kind of went a little more to the forefront. Now they have an idea of, okay, we're going back out there yet again, and it's our chance to kind of get back at them and flip that around this year.
Yeah, I agree. Tom Bertrand, who is watching the show tonight, says, I always look forward to the Bears and a victory over them. Why? Because it's always a hoot to listen to the whining on Chicago radio the next morning. Thanks, Tom, for viewing the show and for your commentary. That leads us into the final game of the 2020 regular season on the road against your Chicago Bears. And if Dave Mogensen has a say in it, Nick Foles as your starting quarterback. A lot of dominoes have to fall in the right order for that scenario to happen. How does it stack up for Green Bay having a division game again for the sixth time in 7 years on the road to conclude the season? And what position does Green Bay have to be in to make this game a non-factor?
I definitely think you're looking at the Packers, the way the season plays out, right? If the thing plays out the way we think it should be, they should be in a good position where they may not even have to win this game to secure where they need to be, right? But it's always fun to have that division game at the end because it gives you the opportunity to have that last division game. If you need to win that game, make it a must win. But the fact that it is a division game also gives it a little more flair, right? Even if the Packers are sitting there, maybe they've already wrapped up the division, need that game for some home field advantage, right? The Bears could be in a position where they're not going to make the playoffs. So they're going to be outside looking in already, and it could maybe be a little bit of a spoiler action. So I think the division games at the end of the year gives that a little bit more flair to games that sometimes are meaningless based on where the schedule and the results have fallen. But it at least gives you that rivalry that even if the Packers have already secured the best they can secure and the Bears have secured the best they can secure, Packers Bears Week 17 is always going to be a game that people are going to want to tune into and be excited about.
Yeah, it should be interesting to see if the Packers have potential playoff implications in Matt LaFleur's second season, which brings us to the final part of our conversation tonight. You are watching Double Coverage Radio live on Facebook. We're talking about the 2020 Green Bay Packers NFL schedule release. We've gone over all the games. We've talked about some of the scenarios, both in the division, in the conference, and intra-conference. Let's talk a little bit about Green Bay being 13-3 last year in 2019. Do you see there a little bit of a decline in terms of the wins? And what's your prediction for Green Bay in terms of we see the schedule now, we've seen how the games have shaped up and how it's going to stack up on paper. How do you think Green Bay does? Do we make the playoffs? What's your prediction right now without any other input before the season even starts, Dave?
I think if you look at the schedule, first of all, if you look back at last year, right, 13-3, they won a lot of one-score games. They were really close to being just a fringe playoff team, right? They definitely were a good team, but they were very close to being 9-7, as close as they were to being 14-2 or 15-1, right? So I think that the Packers look to improve a couple different ways, right? People are always looking at right now, how are they improving this offseason? What have they done to improve? I think the biggest things you want to think about with improving for the Packers is you're taking a whole group of guys who were on the team last year in a brand new system and giving them a whole offseason in this system, right? I think that people kind of lose sight of that fact and don't quite understand the nature of that and how important that is for all these guys to understand what they're doing out there a little bit more than they did, even with the extra mini camps and things. But they have that whole offseason from when they got kicked out until they come back for whenever their mini camps and training camps are to really make some jumps, whether it's second and third year guys trying to make jumps or it's veterans feeling a little bit better. And they'll have that base knowledge down, which will allow Matt LaFleur to kind of peel off the onion and get deeper into his package this year. So we definitely I think that's something that Packer fans really have to look forward to and be thinking about is just that base improvement from being in the second year of a system. If you look at the schedule, I think in best case scenario again for the Packers is probably 13-3. That's if all the cards fall the right way. You're looking at probably losing to San Francisco, and then probably splitting with the Vikings, and probably splitting that Saints or Buccaneers game, right? You're probably going to win one of those and lose one of those. In a best case scenario, you're looking at 13-3. But I think the division winner this year out of the NFC North is probably more in that 11-5 range. I definitely think that the football in the NFC right now is just really too good to see teams that they're going to be at that 13-3, 14-2 kind of area, as we saw teams last year, right, with the Packers and the 49ers both finishing 13-3. So I definitely think that the Packers more realistically will be kind of in that 10-6 to 13-3 range, and that should be good enough to get them an NFC North wins if they have the right combination of those 10 wins.
I love the prediction. I definitely think Green Bay also falls more in the 10 to 13 win sort of range if you're putting it on a spectrum. I don't think a 13-3 season is in the offing, unfortunately, this year, just given the road schedule and sort of the difficulty of some of those games, including at the Niners, at the Saints early on, at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think Green Bay potentially could win the division. Dave, how are you feeling about the Packers running away with it again in the NFC North? And does the wild card from the NFC also come out of the NFC North?
I think that the NFC North is one of the better conferences in football, right? So Minnesota's still a good team. I do question the fact that people kind of think that Minnesota is going to be really, really good still. They did lose a lot of pieces off their team last year, and they're replacing them with young guys and rookies, and that those guys take some time to develop. Unless they're a Hall of Famer, a future Hall of Famer coming in, they usually take a year or two to develop. So I definitely think Minnesota could be due for a couple of years where they kind of fall to the middle of the pack. I do think the Lions are an up and coming team in the NFC North, but you look again at Tom Brady influx. The NFC South is really, really good. I think what the Cowboys are doing makes the NFC East really, really interesting, right? So there's some good football to be played in this conference overall. But I do think that there's a high probability that whoever's second place in the NFC North is going to squeeze into one of those wild card spots for sure.
Yeah, we asked you, the viewing audience, your perspective on the Packers in 2020. Mike Nordentoff says, I'm thinking 10-6 or 11-5. Mike, thanks for the comment. 10-6, 11-5, as Dave said, you thought maybe 11 wins. It'd probably lock up the division in a challenging division, also in a challenging conference in the NFC. I think obviously the favorites would be weighted more heavily towards the NFC. Who represents the NFC in the Super Bowl? I know everything's on paper right now. If you're looking at matchups in terms of where we are strength of schedule in the NFC East, the NFC South, or the NFC West, does the Packers, do they compete for a potentially a Super Bowl berth? And do you see it as a failure if Matt LaFleur doesn't get back to and maybe win that NFC Championship game in 2020?
I definitely think as long as Aaron Rodgers continues to be Aaron Rodgers, the Packers always have an outside shot at the Super Bowl, right? I really think the Packers are building for a 2021 kind of last push with Aaron Rodgers. Not that they can't, the cards could fall again this year as they almost fell last year, right? But I think they're building up, improving guys, looking for that big push. And I think 2021 is the year where they kind of go with an all-out push to make that Super Bowl, right? So the Packers have enough talent to make a Super Bowl. They definitely have the quarterback to make the Super Bowl. It's just going to be a matter of how the cards fall. Again, we talked about the NFC. There's a lot. It's kind of a wide open race right now. I can't sit here and pinpoint who I think is going to be the NFC Super Bowl team. But if you look at, I think realistically in the NFC North, you have the Packers who are realistically a Super Bowl contender. You have other teams around the NFC. You had Tom Brady to darn near any team in this league, and they become a Super Bowl contender, right?
Yeah.
Saints pushing one of the best records in the league last year. Continually very, very good team. Drew Brees still at the top of his game. Solid defense. Philadelphia was just there a couple of years ago. Still has the core of that team together. Again, like I said, you got Dallas. I like what Dallas is doing. Some really good things down there. Mike McCarthy. Packer fans are kind of torn on Mike McCarthy. I'm a huge Mike McCarthy fan, so I'm eager to see what Dallas does down there. I think they can do some really cool and exciting things. But I definitely think there's a lot of good teams in the NFC. We didn't even talk about San Francisco and Seattle out west, right? So there's a big core of teams that are kind of all in there. So it's going to be a matter of who beats up on who. How bad does San Francisco and Seattle beat up on each other? How bad does Minnesota and Green Bay beat up on each other? How bad do the Saints and the Buccaneers beat up on each other? And things like injuries and where the cards fall in the schedules and where bye weeks fall and some of that stuff are going to be really important as the NFC race kind of comes to a head at the end of the season to see where people play out.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think obviously Green Bay has some advantages in terms of being, the frozen tundra and where that stacks up with a lot of their games being on the road in the second half of the season. I think Green Bay loses in the divisional round, probably hosting a wild card game, depending on how things shake out in the conference. You are watching Double Coverage Radio here on Facebook. I am Travis Pipes. He is Dave Mogensen, former offensive coordinator for the Indoor Football League's Green Bay Blizzard, among other stops. Dave, as we start to wind down here, and we'll lead this into our next programming show later this week, we'll break down the rest of the NFC conference. They're scheduling some of those things. What's sort of the big game for you outside of San Francisco for Green Bay to say, hey, we win this, we're finally on the map? Yes, we won 13 games in 2019. How can we get over that hump and really put ourselves on more of the national radar?
From a national perspective, I think the Packers can look at the first half of their season and see two big things, right? They have Minnesota twice in that first half of the season. So if we talked about incremental games, incremental goals, right? If the Packers can sweep Minnesota early on in the season, they can set themselves up to be top of the NFC North. But if you're looking at a national narrative, what game's going to make people notice? You got to circle the Buccaneers game, right? Because the Tom Brady factor. So Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers matchup. We haven't had a lot of those throughout their career, right? Because New England doesn't play the Packers all that often. But we're in a situation here where that's going to be pumped up more than anybody probably wants to understand. There's going to be tons of different commentary for all the various national media sites about that game. So it's going to have a lot of eyes on that game. If the Packers can win that game and maybe win handily, they'll make people say, okay, these guys really are a contender pushing into the San Francisco game a couple of weeks later.
Yeah, we threw it out to the audience about what they were looking for in terms of games that matter on the schedule. Todd Galani, the new varsity football coach of Elkhorn Area High, our alum. We both went to Elkhorn High School for our viewing audience. Elkhorn Elks Thundering Herd right here. He says, I know Mark Murphy asked for an away game the week of the Wisconsin Notre Dame game at Lambeau Field, and he talks about how the field and the track to play on got pretty slick on a normal night during the game at night. He thinks that could potentially be a huge factor in the game against the Falcons. Where are we with the field condition situation, planning against if there's a college football season and the Badgers and the Irish playing? Is that that big of a factor for you being sort of an early opening, quarter of the season type of game? We're not talking about a January game. How concerned are you if you're one of the coaches for this staff saying, hey, we need to make sure the field conditions are where they are and potential injury issues?
Well, I guarantee you that Matt LaFleur was well aware of this, as probably they had an organization where let's get a road game, but it didn't work out that way. So I wouldn't be surprised if they already have their staff and their staff that handles all that ready to go and working on that field all Sunday. It is going to be an issue though, right? Especially depends how the weather is for the game, the Badger game, right? If that weather's fine and things are okay, we don't have a lot of rain, maybe they can take care of it. But if you get a little rain, field gets a little torn up or a little bit slick. They got to come back and turn it around. Who knows? It could be something that's a really big factor in that game on Monday night.
Yeah, we know Paul Chris, the head coach of the Badgers, is probably going to pound it down Notre Dame's throat about 65 times in that game, which I'm thinking is going to be a Badger win. That's subject for another show for us. I just wanted to say thanks for the viewing audience tonight and the participation. I am Travis Pipes, your host of Double Coverage Radio. He is Dave Mogensen, my co-host, stationed just outside of the UW Oshkosh Titan Stadium in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Tune back on Facebook. We're going to be launching some content related to college football and the recruiting classes as we look at the Big Ten Conference. And also don't forget to check us out on the World Wide Web at www.doublecoverageradio.com. Thanks for tuning in tonight. Go Pack Go, and we will talk more football from the preps to the pros next time. Have a great night, everybody.